I stared at the Christmas photo on my phone screen, my hands trembling slightly as I took in every perfect detail. There they all were, gathered around the massive Douglas fir in Margaret's living room, faces glowing with holiday joy and expensive wine. My daughter Rachel, radiant in her new cashmere sweater. My son David, arms wrapped around his wife Jennifer, both of them practically sparkling with contentment. Even the grandchildren, dressed in matching red velvet outfits that cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills. Everyone was there, posed in picture-perfect harmony. Everyone except me. The woman who had quietly funded every single element of this beautiful scene was nowhere to be found. Not in the photo, not in the room, not even mentioned in the caption. Rachel had posted just minutes ago. "Blessed to have such an amazing family Christmas. So grateful for all our traditions and the love we share." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I had been standing right outside that very living room when Rachel's voice carried through the slightly open door. "Mom, maybe you should sit this one out," she had said, her tone gentle but firm. "I mean, you know how these photos are going to look in 10 years. We want them to be timeless and well." She gestured vaguely at me, her eyes avoiding mine. "You understand, right? It's nothing personal. It's just that sometimes older people in family photos can make them look dated." The words had hit me like ice water. At 62, I wasn't ancient, I wasn't decrepit. I was a woman who had worked 3 jobs to put both my children through college, who had quietly paid off Rachel's student loans, who had been the silent financial backbone of this family for decades. But apparently, I was now too old to be included in their picture-perfect Christmas memory. I had smiled and nodded, of course, just like I always did, just like I had been doing for years while my children built their beautiful lives on the foundation I had provided, never once acknowledging the source of their stability. But standing there in the hallway, listening to their laughter as they arranged themselves for photo after photo without me, something crystallized in my chest. A cold, clear certainty that I was done being the invisible woman who funded their dreams while being excluded from their memories. That night, as I sat alone in my modest apartment, the same apartment I'd been living in for 15 years because every extra dollar went to my children's futures, I made a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and began typing an email that would show them exactly who had been paying for their picture-perfect lives all along. But before I tell you about that revelation, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about finding your power when others underestimate you. This is a story about discovering that respect isn't given, it's earned, and sometimes the people closest to you need the biggest wake-up call of all. Growing up as the youngest of 4 children in a working-class family in small-town Ohio, I learned early that love often came, disguised as sacrifice. My parents, Thomas and Betty, worked multiple jobs just to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. Dad was a mechanic by day and a security guard by night. Mom cleaned houses during the week and worked at the local diner on weekends. They never complained, never made us feel like burdens. But I saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the way they counted pennies, the way they went without so we could have. I was different from my siblings. While they dreamed of escape, of college, and career success that would take them far from our struggling hometown, I dreamed of security. Not just for myself, but for the people I loved. I was the one who noticed when Mom's shoes had holes in them, the one who saw Dad taking antacids every night because stress was eating away at his stomach lining. I was the one who vowed that someday I would be successful enough to take care of everyone. When I graduated high school, I didn't have the luxury of choosing my dream college or exploring my passions. Instead, I enrolled in the local community college's business program while working nights at a call center. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. While my friends were having typical college experiences, I was building the foundation for a life of financial stability. I met Robert during my second year, and he seemed to share my values. He worked construction during the day and attended night classes for his engineering degree. We both understood what it meant to work for everything you had. We married young, maybe too young, but we were united in our determination to build something better than what we'd grown up with. When Rachel was born 2 years later, followed by David 18 months after that, I threw myself into motherhood with the same intensity I'd brought to everything else. But I also kept working. While other mothers in our neighborhood had the luxury of staying home full-time, I couldn't afford to stop contributing to our income. We had goals, plans, dreams that required every dollar we could earn. Robert's engineering career took off faster than we'd expected, and my business degree led to a position at a growing marketing firm. By the time the children were in elementary school, we were solidly middle class, finally breathing freely for the first time in our lives. But success, I learned, can be a double-edged sword. As our income grew, so did our children's expectations. Not in a spoiled way exactly, but in the subtle manner that children absorb the security around them and begin to see it as normal, as guaranteed. Rachel showed early signs of artistic talent, and we enrolled her in every class, workshop, and summer program we could find. David excelled at academics and sports, and we made sure he had every advantage, every opportunity to shine. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we were comfortable enough to say yes more often than no. Looking back, I realize this was where the pattern began. The pattern of my children learning to expect support without fully understanding its cost. When Robert died suddenly of a heart attack during David's sophomore year of high school, the foundation of everything I'd built cracked wide open. At 45, I found myself a widow with 2 teenagers, a mortgage, and dreams that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The life insurance helped, but it wouldn't last forever. The comfortable dual-income lifestyle we'd built was gone overnight, and I was left to figure out how to maintain stability for my children during the most crucial years of their education. That's when I made the decision that would define the next 17 years of my life. I would do whatever it took to ensure my children's futures remained intact. If that meant working longer hours, taking on additional projects, or saying no to my own needs, so be it. They had already been through enough trauma losing their father. They shouldn't have to sacrifice their dreams, too. I threw myself into work with a ferocity that surprised even me. I took on freelance marketing projects, in addition to my full-time job. I worked weekends, holidays, late into the night after the children were asleep. Every extra dollar went toward their futures. Rachel's art supplies, private lessons, and eventually her expensive private art college. David's tutoring, sports equipment, and later his pre-med program at an elite university. I told myself I was investing in their happiness, their success, their ability to build lives better than anything I could have imagined at their age. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What I didn't anticipate was how invisible this sacrifice would become to them. As they grew older and their lives became more demanding, the source of their support seemed to fade into background noise. The tuition payments, the rent supplements, the emergency funds I provided whenever they faced financial stress. It all became so routine that they stopped noticing it was happening. They certainly stopped thanking me for it. Rachel graduated with a degree in fine arts and immediately moved to Chicago, where she struggled to find work in her field. For 3 years, I quietly supplemented her income, sending monthly checks so she could afford to live in the trendy neighborhood she loved while pursuing her dream of becoming a professional artist. When she finally landed a position at a prestigious gallery, she celebrated as if she'd achieved it entirely through her own merit. The thousands of dollars I'd sent to keep her afloat during those lean years became invisible history. David's journey was similar. Medical school was expensive, far more expensive than either of us had anticipated. Even with scholarships and loans, there were gaps: books, equipment, living expenses in an expensive city, the cost of board exams and residency interviews. I covered what I could, often dipping into my own retirement savings to ensure he wouldn't graduate buried in debt. When he matched into a competitive residency program, he credited his hard work and determination. The financial support that had made his focus possible was forgotten. But the invisibility of my contributions wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was watching them build lives I could barely afford to visit. Rachel's chic Chicago apartment, filled with expensive furniture and artwork I couldn't pronounce. David's wedding to Jennifer, an elaborate affair in wine country that cost more than I made in 6 months. Their assumption that I would contribute to these expenses without question, while simultaneously excluding me from the planning and decision-making process. I found myself becoming a silent financier of experiences I wasn't truly part of. I paid for family vacations I couldn't afford to join because I was working extra hours to cover the cost. I contributed to home renovations for houses I was rarely invited to visit. I funded birthday parties, anniversary celebrations, and holiday gatherings where my presence was tolerated rather than treasured. The gradual shift was so subtle, I almost didn't notice it happening. Somewhere along the way, I had become the family ATM rather than the family matriarch. My children loved me, I believed that, but they loved me the way you love a reliable utility. You don't think about electricity until the power goes out. You don't appreciate running water until the pipes freeze. And you don't value the person funding your lifestyle until they stop paying the bills. By the time Rachel announced her engagement to Marcus, a struggling musician with expensive tastes, and David started talking about buying a house in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, I was working 80-hour weeks to keep up with their financial needs. I had postponed my own retirement, downsized my living situation, and eliminated every personal luxury from my budget. But I told myself it was temporary, that once they were fully established in their careers, the burden would lighten. I was wrong. Success didn't make them more independent. It made them more expensive. Rachel's wedding required a larger contribution than David's. The grandchildren needed private schools, music lessons, sports equipment, college funds. David's career advancement came with social expectations, the right clothes, the right house, the right lifestyle to match his professional standing. My financial support didn't decrease as they became more successful. It escalated. But the breaking point wasn't about money. Money I could handle. I'd been handling it for years. The breaking point was about recognition, about being seen and valued for something other than my ability to write checks. It was about being included in the life I had been quietly building for them for decades. That Christmas morning, standing in Margaret's beautiful living room, a room I had helped furnish through years of generous gifts, watching my family pose for their perfect photographs without me, I realized something that should have been obvious years earlier. I had become invisible not because I was unimportant, but because I had made myself too available, too reliable, too willing to give without asking for anything in return. The photograph on my phone wasn't just a Christmas memory, it was a visual representation of how my family saw me. As someone who belonged behind the scenes, not in the picture. Someone whose contributions were appreciated but not acknowledged. Someone whose presence was optional, but whose financial support was essential. That night, alone in my apartment with a cup of tea and my laptop, I began researching something I should have investigated years earlier. Exactly how much money I had given my children over the past 2 decades. Bank statements, tax records, credit card bills, canceled checks. I compiled it all into a spreadsheet that told a story I had never fully comprehended. The numbers were staggering. Between tuition payments, rent supplements, loan payoffs, wedding contributions, house down payments, emergency funds, and countless smaller expenses, I had given my children nearly $400,000 over 20 years. $400,000. Money that could have secured my own retirement, could have allowed me to travel, to pursue hobbies, to build a life of my own. Instead, I had quietly transferred my financial security to my children, enabling them to build the picture-perfect lives they now enjoyed. Lives that apparently didn't have room for the woman who had made them possible. As I stared at those numbers, a calm certainty settled over me. It was time for my children to understand the true cost of their picture-perfect Christmas. It was time for them to learn that respect isn't inherited, it's earned. And it was time for me to stop being the invisible woman who made their dreams possible while being excluded from their memories. The email I was about to send would change everything. But for the first time in years, I was ready for that change. I was ready to step out of the shadows and into the light, even if it meant my children would finally have to see me clearly for the first time in decades. The months following that Christmas photo revelation weren't dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no explosive confrontation, no tearful family meeting where everything was laid bare and forgiveness was sought. Instead, there was something far more unsettling for my children. Silence. The kind of silence that grows heavier with each passing day, the kind that makes you question things you'd never thought to question before. I didn't send that email immediately. Instead, I sat with those numbers, with that spreadsheet that told the story of 2 decades of invisible generosity, and I began to understand something profound about myself. I had been living my life in the margins of other people's stories, content to be the footnote that made their success possible. But footnotes, I realized, are only noticed by people who care enough to read the fine print. My children had been skimming the headlines of their lives for years, never bothering to understand the foundation that made their achievements possible. The first sign that something had shifted came 3 days after Christmas. Rachel called, her voice bright with post-holiday excitement, chattering about the gifts she'd received and the compliments on her perfectly coordinated family photos. She was planning a New Year's Eve party at her apartment and needed money. For catering. Not asking for money, mind you, but assuming it would be provided. "Mom, I need about $1,500 for the caterer. You know how important it is for Marcus and me to maintain our social connections in the art world. These networking events are crucial for our careers." I listened to her explanation, the casual entitlement in her voice, the assumption that my financial support was as reliable as sunrise. For 20 years, I would have found a way to make that $1,500 appear. I would have worked extra hours, dipped into savings, or delayed paying my own bills. But that day, for the first time in decades, I said something that surprised us both. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but I can't help with that right now." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When Rachel finally spoke, confusion colored every word. "What do you mean you can't help? Is everything okay? Are you having money problems?" The irony of her concern was almost laughable. For years I had been having money problems. I'd been robbing my own future to fund their presents, sacrificing my security for their comfort. But they'd been so insulated from the reality of my financial situation that they'd never noticed the strain. "I'm fine," I said simply. "I just think it's time for you to handle these expenses on your own. You're a successful gallery professional now. I'm sure you'll figure it out." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of that small act of rebellion. It felt strange to prioritize my own financial stability, to say no to a request that I could technically afford but shouldn't be expected to fulfill. For the first time in years, I felt like I was making a choice based on what was best for me, not what was easiest for my children. David's call came 2 days later. He needed help with the down payment on a house in an exclusive neighborhood where homes started at $800,000. He'd been pre-approved for a mortgage, but the down payment was substantial, and he was hoping I could contribute $50,000 to help them secure their dream home. "Jennifer and I have been looking at this place for months," he explained, his voice filled with the excitement of someone who'd never been told no. "It's perfect for starting our family, and the schools in that district are incredible. We're competing with other buyers, so we need to move fast. I know it's a lot, but you've always supported our big life decisions. I had always supported their big life decisions. I'd supported Rachel's decision to attend an expensive private art college. I'd supported David's choice to pursue medicine despite the crushing debt it would involve. I'd supported weddings, career changes, moves to expensive cities, and countless other choices that had required my financial backing to become reality. But sitting in my modest apartment, looking around at the secondhand furniture and outdated appliances I'd been living with for years, while my children accumulated designer belongings, I felt something shift inside me. A quiet rebellion against the assumption that my money was their money, that my future was less important than their comfort. David, I said carefully, $50,000 is more than I make in a year. I need you to think about what you're asking me to do. But you helped us before, he said, and I could hear the confusion in his voice. You paid for medical school. You contributed to the wedding. This is just the next step. This is the step where you stand on your own, I replied. You're a doctor now. You have a good income. It's time for you to build your life with your own resources. The conversation ended awkwardly, with David promising to call back once he'd figured out what was going on with me. As if my decision to stop funding their lifestyle was a mysterious ailment that needed diagnosis rather than a healthy boundary that was long overdue. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Small requests that had always been automatically approved were now met with gentle but firm refusals. Rachel needed money for art supplies for a project she was excited about. David wanted help covering the cost of a medical conference in Hawaii. Margaret, who had somehow learned about my newfound unavailability, called to express concern about my financial difficulties. Each conversation revealed how deeply embedded their assumptions had become. They couldn't conceive of me having money but choosing not to share it. The idea that I might prioritize my own needs, might save for my own future, might want to enjoy the fruits of my labor myself, these concepts were foreign to them. But the most telling moment came when Rachel stopped by my apartment unannounced one evening in mid-January. She'd been in the neighborhood, she said, and thought she'd check on me. She walked through my small space with barely concealed shock, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. "Mom," she said finally, settling onto my worn couch. "Why do you live like this? This place is so small, and your furniture looks like it came from garage sales." I looked around my apartment through her eyes. She was right, of course. My furniture was old, my appliances outdated, my decorations minimal. I'd been living like a college student for years while funding their adult lifestyles. They lived in beautiful homes filled with quality belongings, while I made do with whatever was cheap and functional. "This is what I can afford," I said simply. "But you have money," she protested. "You've always had money when we needed it." The past tense she used, "when we needed it," revealed everything. She couldn't imagine that I might need money too, that I might want to upgrade my living situation, might dream of traveling, might hope to retire someday with dignity and security. "I have money because I've been careful with it," I explained. "Because I've lived below my means and saved what I could. That money represents my security, my future. It's not an emergency fund for your convenience." Rachel's eyes widened as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. "But we're family," she said. "Family helps each other." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "Family helps each other. When was the last time you helped me with anything?" The question hung in the air between us. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. I could see her mentally scrolling through our recent interactions, searching for examples of reciprocal support. The search was taking longer than either of us expected. You never asked for help," she finally stammered. "I shouldn't have to ask," I replied. "If we're family, If family helps each other, then you should notice when I'm struggling. You should offer support without being asked. You should care about my well-being as much as I've cared about yours. That conversation marked a turning point, not just in my relationship with Rachel, but in my understanding of what I'd been accepting for years. I'd been so focused on being the giver, the supporter, the reliable financial backup, that I'd forgotten I deserved to receive care in return. I'd taught my children that love flowed in only one direction, from me to them, and they'd learned that lesson perfectly. The silence that followed wasn't punishment. It was space. Space for them to consider what they'd taken for granted. Space for me to rebuild my sense of self-worth. Space for all of us to discover what our relationships looked like when they weren't lubricated by my constant financial contributions. During those quiet weeks, I began to reclaim pieces of myself I'd forgotten existed. I started taking long walks in the park, something I'd never had time for when I was working extra hours to fund their lives. I rediscovered my love of reading, checking out novels from the library and spending entire Sunday afternoons lost in other people's stories. I began cooking elaborate meals for myself, trying new recipes and enjoying the simple pleasure of creating something beautiful just for my own enjoyment. Most importantly, I started making plans, real plans for my own future. I researched retirement communities I might actually be able to afford if I stopped hemorrhaging money to my children. I looked into travel packages for singles over 60, imagining myself exploring places I'd always wanted to see but had never prioritized. I even began investigating volunteer opportunities, ways I could use my business skills to help people who would genuinely appreciate the support. For the first time in decades, I was thinking about what I wanted rather than what my children needed. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. The breakthrough came in early February. David called with what he clearly thought was good news. He and Jennifer had found a different house, one they could afford without my help. His tone suggested he expected praise for this development, as if demonstrating basic adult financial responsibility was an achievement worthy of celebration. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it. "I'm proud of you for finding a solution that works within your budget." "Well, it's not exactly what we wanted," he admitted. "It's smaller, and the neighborhood isn't quite as prestigious. But Jennifer's parents offered to help with the down payment, so we can make it work." The casual mention of Jennifer's parents' contribution stung more than I expected. Not because I was jealous of their generosity, but because it highlighted how easily my children had replaced my financial support with someone else's. I wasn't irreplaceable. I was just convenient. But that realization, painful as it was, also brought clarity. If my children could find other sources of support when I wasn't available, then my financial contributions hadn't been about necessity. They'd been about enabling. I'd been making their lives easier, not making their lives possible. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I calculated how much money I would have available for my own use now that I wasn't supplementing my children's income. The number was staggering. For the first time since Robert's death, I would be able to live comfortably on my earnings. I could afford to upgrade my living situation, to travel, to enjoy the lifestyle I'd been funding for my children. The anger I expected to feel about the wasted years never came. Instead, I felt something much more powerful. Hope. Hope that it wasn't too late to build a life I loved. Hope that my children might learn to value me for more than my financial contributions. Hope that the woman who had spent decades in the background might finally step into the spotlight of her own story. But before I could move forward, there was one conversation I needed to have. Not with my children. They weren't ready to hear what I needed to say. But with myself. I needed to understand how I'd become so comfortable being invisible, so willing to sacrifice my own dreams for other people's comfort. The answer, when it came, was both simple and devastating. I'd confused love with sacrifice. I'd believed that giving until it hurt was proof of devotion, that suffering in silence was evidence of strength. I'd taught my children that my needs didn't matter by consistently prioritizing theirs. And they'd learned that lesson so well that they'd stopped seeing me as a person with my own desires and dreams. Sitting alone in my apartment that February evening, surrounded by the modest belongings I'd accumulated while funding their luxury, I made a promise to myself. I would never again mistake being used for being loved. I would never again confuse being needed for being valued. And I would never again accept being invisible in exchange for being indispensable. The reckoning was coming. My children just didn't know it yet. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March, disguised as something so ordinary I almost missed its significance. I was at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, when my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. The message was accompanied by a photo that made my blood run cold. It was a screenshot of a social media post from one of her gallery colleagues, showing a lavish birthday party at an upscale restaurant. The caption read, "Amazing night celebrating Jessica's 30th. Thanks to Rachel for organizing such an incredible celebration at Le Bernardin." The photo showed Rachel, radiant and confident, surrounded by beautifully dressed people in what was clearly one of the city's most expensive restaurants. The text that followed was casual, almost throwaway. "Had the most amazing time last night. Spent way too much on Jessica's party, but so worth it for networking. LOL. Good thing I'm not asking you for money anymore." I stared at that message. For a long time, my coffee growing cold as I processed what I was seeing. Rachel, who had told me just weeks ago that she couldn't afford basic art supplies without my help, had apparently hosted an elaborate birthday celebration at a restaurant where appetizers cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. Rachel, who had made me feel guilty for not being able to contribute to her New Year's Eve party, was now laughing about her expensive choices while simultaneously patting herself on the back for not asking me to fund them. But it wasn't the hypocrisy that broke something inside me. It was the emoji. That laughing face, as if my decision to stop bankrolling her lifestyle was amusing rather than reasonable. As if my years of sacrifice had been so expected, so automatic, that choosing to prioritize my own financial security was now a punchline. I set my phone down carefully and walked to my bedroom, where I kept the folder I'd been building since Christmas. Inside were bank statements, canceled checks, tax records, and the detailed spreadsheet that documented every dollar I'd given my children over the past 20 years. But now I added something new, a small notebook where I'd been recording their recent spending choices, the purchases they'd made while claiming they couldn't afford basic necessities without my support. David's new watch, a luxury Swiss timepiece he'd posted about on social media. Jennifer's designer handbag collection, visible in the background of their house hunting photos. Rachel's expensive dinners out, her weekend trips to wine country, her collection of vintage art pieces that filled her apartment. They weren't struggling. They never had been. They'd simply been choosing to spend their money on luxuries while relying on me to cover their necessities. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went shopping. Not for groceries or practical items, but for myself. I drove to the nicest department store in town and bought a beautiful silk scarf in deep burgundy, the kind of accessory I'd admired but never purchased because there were always more pressing financial priorities. I bought expensive hand cream that smelled like lavender and felt like silk. I treated myself to lunch at a restaurant I'd always wanted to try, ordering wine in the middle of the day and savoring every sip. As I sat in that restaurant, surrounded by other women my age who seemed comfortable taking up space, spending money on their own pleasure, I realized how long it had been since I'd felt entitled to enjoy my own life. Decades of putting my children's wants before my own needs had trained me to see self-care as selfishness, to view personal pleasure as frivolous waste. But watching the other diners, women laughing with friends, treating themselves to expensive meals, Clearly comfortable with the idea that they deserved good things, I understood something profound. These women hadn't raised children who expected them to live like martyrs. They'd raised children who understood that parents were people too, with their own desires and dreams and right to happiness. I had raised children who saw me as a resource, rather than a person. And I had only myself to blame for that. The revelation that followed was like stepping into sunlight after years in a cave. I didn't have to live this way. I didn't have to accept being treated like an ATM with emotions. I didn't have to pretend that my children's casual disregard for my financial sacrifice was acceptable because we were family. Family should mean mutual respect, not one-sided obligation. Family should mean caring about each other's well-being, not taking each other's generosity for granted. Family should mean wanting everyone to thrive, not just accepting that one person would sacrifice so others could prosper. That evening, I began planning something I should have done years earlier. An intervention, not the kind where you confront someone about their destructive behavior, but the kind where you confront them with the truth they've been avoiding. My children needed to understand exactly what their comfortable lifestyle had cost, and who had been paying the price. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing. I created a comprehensive financial timeline, documenting not just the money I'd given them, but the opportunities I'd sacrificed to make those gifts possible. The vacations I hadn't taken, the home improvements I'd postponed, the retirement, contributions I'd skipped, the dreams I'd deferred. I researched the current market value of every major gift I'd given them over the years. Rachel's college tuition, adjusted for inflation and investment returns, would be worth nearly $300,000 today. David's medical school support would have grown to over $400,000. The house down payments, wedding contributions, and countless smaller expenses added up to a sum that took my breath away. If I had invested the money I'd given my children instead of simply handing it over, I would be a millionaire today. I would own my home outright. I would have a retirement account that would allow me to travel the world. I would have options, choices, freedom. Instead, I was 62 years old, living in a cramped apartment, working full-time with no clear retirement plan, while my children lived in beautiful homes and complained about spending too much money on restaurant dinners. But the most important part of my preparation wasn't financial, it was emotional. I practiced having difficult conversations in front of my bathroom mirror. I rehearsed setting boundaries without apologizing for them. I learned to say things like, "That doesn't work for me," and "I'm not available for that," without following up with explanations or justifications. Most importantly, I practiced holding space for my own worth. For years, I'd been so focused on being useful to my children that I'd forgotten I had value beyond my ability to solve their problems. I was intelligent, accomplished, resourceful, and kind. I deserved relationships based on mutual respect, not one-sided utility. The plan I developed was elegant in its simplicity. I would invite both my children to dinner at a nice restaurant, my treat, one final time. Over a meal they couldn't storm out of without causing a scene, I would present them with a detailed accounting of our financial relationship over the past 20 years. Not to make them feel guilty, but to make them understand the reality they'd been living in. Then I would announce my retirement from my role as their financial backup plan. No more emergency funds, no more contributions to their lifestyle expenses. No more enabling their assumption that my money was their money. But most importantly, I would explain what our relationship could become if they were willing to see me as a person rather than a resource. I would outline what mutual respect looked like, what reciprocal care meant, what genuine family connection required. If they were willing to meet me in that space, we could build something real together. If they weren't, at least I would know where I stood. The dinner was scheduled for a Friday night in April. As the date approached, I felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that reminded me of standing at the edge of a high diving board as a child. The jump was terrifying, but the alternative, climbing back down the ladder in defeat, was worse. 3 days before our scheduled dinner, Margaret called. My former mother-in-law had always been perceptive, and she'd clearly noticed the shift in family dynamics. "I don't know what's going on with you and the children," she said without preamble, "but Rachel is worried about your mental health. She thinks you might be having some kind of breakdown." The accusation stung, but it didn't surprise me. Of course, they would interpret my newfound boundaries as mental illness. When someone who has always said yes suddenly starts saying no, it's easier to pathologize their behavior than to examine your own expectations. "I'm not having a breakdown, Margaret," I said calmly. "I'm having a breakthrough. I'm finally understanding that being a good mother doesn't mean sacrificing my entire life for my children's comfort." "But family is supposed to support each other," she protested, echoing the same argument Rachel had made weeks earlier. "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "Family is supposed to support each other, all members of the family, not just the older generation supporting the younger one indefinitely." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Margaret, like my children, had never considered that support might flow both ways. They'd all been so comfortable with the arrangement where I gave, and they received that they'd forgotten to question whether it was fair or sustainable. "I think you're making a mistake," Margaret said finally. "Family is the most important thing. Don't let pride ruin your relationships with your children." After I hung up, I sat with her words for a long time. Was I letting pride ruin my relationships? Or was I finally developing enough self-respect to demand relationships worth having? The answer came to me as I looked around my modest apartment, thinking about the beautiful homes my children lived in with money I'd provided. Pride wasn't the problem. The problem was that I'd been so afraid of being seen as selfish that I'd become selfless to the point of self-destruction. There's a difference between healthy pride and destructive arrogance. Healthy pride means knowing your worth and insisting that others recognize it too. Destructive arrogance means demanding more than you deserve or give. What I was asking for, basic respect, reciprocal care, acknowledgement of my sacrifice, wasn't arrogance. It was the foundation of any healthy relationship. That realization gave me the courage I needed for what was coming. In 2 days, I would sit across from my children and explain exactly how our relationship was going to change. I would show them the financial records that revealed the true cost of their comfortable lives. I would tell them about the dreams I'd deferred and the opportunities I'd sacrificed. But most importantly, I would tell them about the future I was choosing for myself. A future where my worth wasn't measured by my willingness to give everything away. A future where I was valued for who I was, not what I could provide. They could choose to be part of that future or not. But for the first time in decades, the choice would be theirs to make rather than mine to accommodate. The woman who had spent Christmas standing in the hallway, too old to be included in family photos, was about to reclaim her place at the center of her own life. And this time, she wouldn't be asking for permission. The restaurant I chose for our dinner was deliberate in every detail. Chez Laurent wasn't the most expensive place in the city, but it was elegant enough to command respect, quiet enough for serious conversation, and public enough that my children would have to maintain their composure regardless of how they received what I was about to tell them. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the burgundy silk scarf I'd bought myself and a confidence I'd been building for months. When Rachel and David walked in together, they'd apparently coordinated their arrival, which told me they suspected. This wasn't going to be an ordinary family dinner. I felt a moment of profound clarity. These were my children, the people I loved most in the world, but they were also adults who had been taking advantage of my generosity for so long that they'd forgotten it was a choice I made rather than an obligation I owed. Rachel looked stunning. As always, in a designer dress I recognized from her social media posts. David wore a suit that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in a year. They both carried themselves with the easy confidence of people who had never had to worry about money because someone else was always there to worry about it for them. "Mom, you look nice," Rachel said, settling into her chair with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to fine dining. "This place is lovely. What's the occasion?" "The occasion," I said, placing a leather portfolio on the table between us, "is honesty. We need to have a conversation that's long overdue." David frowned, his eyes moving from the portfolio to my face. "Is everything okay? You've been acting strange lately. Margaret said you might be having some kind of crisis." I smiled, feeling calmer than I'd expected. "I'm not having a crisis. I'm having a revelation, and it's time you both understood what your lives have actually cost and who has been paying the bill." The portfolio contained copies of every financial document I'd compiled over the past months. Bank statements showing transfers to their accounts, canceled checks for tuition, payments, rent supplements, emergency funds, credit card statements for purchases I'd made on their behalf, tax records showing the gifts I'd reported to the IRS year after year. 20 years, I said, opening the portfolio and placing the first spreadsheet in front of them. "That's how long I've been supplementing your lives. $437,000. That's the total amount I've given you both since your father died." Rachel's face went pale as she stared at the numbers. "Mom, what is this?" "This is accountability," I replied. "This is the cost of your comfortable lives, itemized and calculated. Every tuition payment, every rent check, every emergency fund, transfer, every contribution to your weddings, your house purchases, your lifestyle expenses." David picked up one of the bank statements, his hands shaking slightly. "I don't understand. Why are you showing us this?" "Because you've forgotten," I said simply. "You've become so accustomed to my financial support that you've stopped seeing it as generosity and started treating it as an entitlement. You've built your lives on a foundation I provided, and then you've excluded me from enjoying the structures you built." I pulled out my phone and showed them the Christmas photo that had started this entire journey. This picture was taken in a room I helped furnish, wearing clothes I helped you afford, celebrating a holiday I've been funding for years. But I wasn't welcome in the frame because I was too old to fit your aesthetic. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, that wasn't... We didn't mean..." "You absolutely meant it," I interrupted, my voice remaining steady. "You meant every word. You've been making decisions about my worth based on my appearance, my age, my usefulness to your image, and I've been allowing it because I confused being needed with being loved." The waiter approached our table and I ordered wine for all three of us before continuing. "But tonight isn't about blame. It's about change. It's about establishing what our relationship looks like moving forward." David leaned back in his chair, his face cycling through confusion, guilt, and something that looked like anger. "Are you cutting us off? Is this some kind of punishment?" "This is me choosing myself for the first time in decades," I replied. "I'm 62 years old. I've spent the last 20 years working extra hours, living below my means, and sacrificing my own dreams so you could have everything you wanted. And in return, you've treated me like a reliable utility rather than a person with my own needs and desires." I opened another section of the portfolio, revealing the calculations I'd made about my lost opportunities. If I had invested the money I gave you instead of simply handing it over, I would have over $800,000 in retirement savings today. I would own my own home. I would have the freedom to travel, to pursue hobbies, to live without constantly worrying about money. "But we didn't ask you to sacrifice those things," Rachel protested, her voice breaking. "You didn't ask me not to sacrifice them either," I replied. "You never once suggested that I should prioritize my own financial security. You never asked if I could afford the contributions you requested. You never offered to pay me back when your situations improved. You simply accepted my generosity as if it was your birthright." The wine arrived, and I took a sip before continuing. The alcohol helped steady my nerves, but it was the clarity of my purpose that gave me strength. "I want to tell you about the woman I used to be," I said, my voice softening. Before your father died, I had dreams. I wanted to start my own marketing consultancy. I wanted to travel through Europe. I wanted to take art classes and learn to paint. I wanted to buy a little house near the ocean where I could spend my retirement years. David and Rachel exchanged glances, and I could see them trying to reconcile this version of me with the woman they'd known. The woman who existed primarily to solve their problems and fund their dreams. When your father died, those dreams didn't disappear. I just put them aside because you needed me. You were grieving. You were young. You had your whole lives ahead of you. It felt right to sacrifice my future for yours. But somewhere along the way, the temporary sacrifice became a permanent arrangement. I pulled out my phone and showed them photos I'd taken during my recent shopping trip, my lunch at the expensive restaurant, the small acts of self-care I'd been practicing. This is who I'm choosing to become. A woman who values herself enough to spend money on her own pleasure. A woman who makes plans based on her own desires rather than other people's expectations. "But we love you," Rachel said, tears streaming down her face. "We don't want you to feel unappreciated." "Then start appreciating me," I replied, "not just in words, but in actions. When was the last time either of you asked about my dreams? When was the last time you offered to help me with something? When was the last time you included me in your plans because you wanted my company, not because you needed my money?" The questions hung in the air like smoke. I could see them both searching their memories, trying to find examples of reciprocal care, moments when they'd prioritized my well-being over their own convenience. "We thought you were happy," David said finally. "You never complained. You never said you wanted anything different." "I was happy to help you," I corrected, "but I was also afraid to ask for anything in return because I thought that would make me selfish. I taught you that my needs didn't matter by never expressing them. I taught you that my money was your money by never setting boundaries. I taught you that my love was conditional on my usefulness by never requiring you to love me back in meaningful ways." I opened the final section of my portfolio, revealing the future I was planning for myself. "I'm not cutting you off out of anger. I'm stepping back out of love. Love for myself, which I'm finally learning to prioritize, and love for you, because you deserve the chance to become adults who understand that relationships require mutual investment." The documents showed my plans for early retirement, funded by the money I would no longer be giving away. The small house near the coast I'd found, well within my budget if I stopped supplementing their lifestyles. The travel itinerary I'd been planning, the art classes I'd enrolled in, the volunteer work I wanted to pursue. "This is my new life," I said. "A life where I'm the main character of my own story instead of a supporting player in yours. You're welcome to be part of it, but only if you can see me as a whole person with my own needs and dreams." Rachel reached across the table and touched my hand. "Mom, I had no idea you felt this way. I thought you liked helping us. I thought it made you feel needed." "It did make me feel needed," I admitted. "But I confused being needed with being valued. I thought if I made myself indispensable, you would never leave me. But what happened instead is that you started seeing me as a service rather than a person." David was staring at the numbers on the spreadsheet, his face pale. $400,000, he murmured. I never thought about it adding up like that." "That's exactly the problem," I said. "You never thought about it. You never had to think about it because I made it so easy for you to take without acknowledging what you were receiving." I signaled the waiter and ordered dinner for all of us. Salmon for me, knowing I could afford it without calculating the cost against other necessities for the first time in years. "I want you to understand something important," I continued as we waited for our food. "This isn't about punishing you for past behavior. This is about creating space for better behavior in the future. I'm giving you the opportunity to know me as a person rather than a resource." "What does that look like?" Rachel asked, her voice small. It looks like calling me to ask how I'm doing without needing anything from me. It looks like inviting me to family events because you want my company, not because you feel obligated. It looks like including me in photographs because I'm your mother and you love me, not excluding me because I don't fit your aesthetic. I took another sip of wine, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. It looks like offering to help me when I need support, the way I've helped you for years. It looks like caring about my dreams and goals the way I've cared about yours. We can do that, David said quickly. We want to do that. I hope so, I replied. But I need you to understand that it's going to require real change. You can't go back to treating me like an ATM just because you've apologized. You can't expect me to resume funding your lifestyle because you promised to appreciate me more. Our food arrived, and for a few minutes we ate in silence, each of us processing the weight of what had been said. The salmon was perfectly prepared. The wine was excellent, and for once I was enjoying an expensive meal without calculating its cost or feeling guilty about the indulgence. I've already made some changes, I said as we finished eating. I've put a down payment on a house near the ocean. I've enrolled in art classes. I've booked a trip to Italy for next month, something I've wanted to do for 30 years but never felt I could afford. Rachel's eyes widened. Italy? By yourself? By myself, I confirmed. For myself. Because I deserve to have experiences that bring me joy, and I'm done waiting for permission to pursue them. David was still staring at the financial documents. Can I keep copies of these? Of course, I said. I want you to understand exactly what your comfortable lives have cost. Not so you'll feel guilty, but so you'll understand the magnitude of what I've given and what I'm choosing to stop giving. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Rachel grabbed my arm. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry we took you for granted. I'm sorry we excluded you from photos. I'm sorry we treated your money like it was ours. I accept your apology, I said, and I meant it. But apologies are just words. What matters now is how you choose to behave moving forward. David hugged me tightly as we stood outside the restaurant. I love you, Mom, not for what you can give us, but for who you are. I want to learn how to show you that. Then you will, I said simply. Because love is a choice we make every day, and I'm choosing to love myself enough to demand the love I deserve in return. As I drove home that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. The conversation hadn't gone exactly as I'd planned. There had been more tears, more immediate acceptance than I'd expected. But the important work was done. The truth was finally out in the open. Whether my children would follow through on their promises remained to be seen. But for the first time in decades, that wasn't my responsibility. I had created the opportunity for better relationships. What they did with that opportunity was up to them. The woman who had been excluded from Christmas photos was now choosing her own frame, painting her own picture, writing her own story, and this time, she was definitely the main character. The weeks following our restaurant revelation unfolded like a delicate dance between old patterns and new possibilities. My children's responses to the truth I'd laid bare were as different as their personalities, and watching them navigate this new reality became a fascinating study in human adaptability, or the lack thereof. Rachel was the first to reach out, calling me just 3 days after our dinner. Her voice carried a vulnerability I hadn't heard since she was a teenager dealing with her first heartbreak. Mom, I've been thinking about everything you said, and I want you to know that I've started seeing a therapist. I realized I don't actually know who you are as a person, outside of being my mother. That's really messed up, isn't it? The admission caught me off guard. I'd expected defensiveness, maybe some bargaining, certainly some testing of my newly established boundaries. But genuine self-reflection? That was more than I'd dared to hope for. It's not messed up, sweetheart, I said. settling into my favorite chair with a cup of tea. It's just incomplete. We have time to change. That if you want to. I do want to, she said quickly. But I'm scared I don't know how. Like, what do I even ask you? What are your favorite movies? What makes you laugh? What do you think about when you're alone? The questions were so basic, so fundamental to knowing another person, that their novelty was both heartbreaking and hopeful. How had we lived in each other's lives for 32 years without covering this essential ground? Well, I said, smiling despite myself, my favorite movie is The Way We Were, because it reminds me that sometimes love isn't enough if people can't grow together. I laugh at British comedies and dad jokes that are so bad they're good. And when I'm alone, I think about all the places I want to see and all the things I want to learn. There was silence on the other end of the line, and when Rachel spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. I want to know all of those things. I want to know everything. Would you? Would you maybe want to have coffee sometime? Just to talk? I promise I won't ask for anything except your time. That coffee date, which happened the following Saturday at a small cafe near my apartment, became the foundation of something entirely new between us. For 2 hours, we talked about everything except her problems or needs. She asked about my childhood, my dreams before marriage and motherhood, my opinions on books and art and politics. I learned that she'd inherited my love of rainy days and my tendency to cry at commercials featuring elderly couples. Most surprisingly, I discovered that my daughter was funny, genuinely, cleverly funny, in ways I'd never noticed when our conversations centered around her crises and my solutions. She did impressions of her gallery colleagues that had me laughing until my stomach hurt. She told stories about her dating disasters with a self-deprecating humor that revealed depth I'd never suspected. You know what's weird? She said as we prepared to leave. This is the most fun I've had in months. I always thought family time was supposed to be about dealing with problems or celebrating achievements. I never knew it could just be enjoyable. The revelation that spending time with me could be pleasurable rather than merely necessary seemed to genuinely surprise her. It was a painful reminder of how transactional our relationship had become, but also a promising glimpse of what it could evolve into. David's response was more complicated. He called less frequently after our dinner, and when he did, his tone was formal, almost businesslike. I sensed he was struggling with anger. Not at me, exactly, but at the situation, at himself, at the realization that his comfortable life had been built on a foundation he'd never acknowledged. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later when he showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Wednesday evening. He looked exhausted, his usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled. "I've been going over those numbers every night," he said without preamble. "The money you gave us. I calculated what you could have earned if you'd invested it instead of giving it away. Jennifer thinks I'm having some kind of breakdown because I keep talking about compound interest and opportunity costs." I invited him in and made coffee, while he paced around my small living room like a caged animal. "The thing that kills me," he continued, "is that I'm a doctor. I'm supposed to be smart. How did I never realize what this was costing you? How did I never do the math?" "Because you didn't need to," I said simply. "I made it so easy for you to take without thinking that thinking became unnecessary." He stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I want to pay you back." "David?" "No, listen. I've been looking at our finances, and we can do it. It'll take a few years and we'll have to make some lifestyle changes, but we can pay you back. With interest. All of it." The offer was generous and well-intentioned, but it missed the point entirely. "I don't want your money," I said gently. "That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" he demanded, frustration creeping into his voice. "What do you want from us?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with decades of misunderstanding. I could see him struggling to comprehend that there might not be a transaction that could fix this, no payment plan that could restore the old equilibrium. "I want you to see me," I said finally. "Not as a problem to be solved or a debt to be repaid, but as a person with my own life and interests and dreams. I want you to care about my well-being the way I've cared about yours." He sat down heavily on my couch, his head in his hands. "I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to have a relationship with you that isn't about need, about me, needing something and you providing it." The admission was raw and honest, and it gave me hope even as it broke my heart. "We'll figure it out together," I said. "But first, you have to want to figure it out. You have to be willing to see me as someone worth knowing, not just someone worth using." The conversation that followed was difficult and sometimes uncomfortable, but it was also the most honest exchange David and I had ever had. He talked about the pressure he felt to maintain a certain lifestyle as a doctor, the way Jennifer's family's wealth made him feel inadequate, the fear that admitting he couldn't afford something would make him seem like a failure. I talked about the loneliness of being financially generous while being emotionally invisible, the way I'd convinced myself that giving was the same as loving, the gradual erosion of my sense of self-worth as I became defined entirely by my usefulness to others. By the time he left that evening, something fundamental had shifted between us. We hadn't solved everything. That would take time and consistent effort. But we'd established a foundation of honesty that hadn't existed before. Meanwhile, my own transformation was accelerating in ways that surprised even me. The house near the ocean that I'd put a down payment on was everything I'd dreamed of. A small cottage with weathered shingles and large windows that looked out over rolling dunes. The closing was scheduled for early June, and I found myself spending hours online researching coastal gardening and beach house decorating. The art classes I'd enrolled in were a revelation. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I joined 12 other adults in a bright studio space, learning to see light and shadow, color and form in entirely new ways. My instructor, a woman named Elena who was about my age and had started painting, seriously only after her own children left home, became both teacher and friend. "You have a natural eye for composition," she told me after I'd completed my third watercolor landscape. "Have you ever considered that this might be more than a hobby for you?" The suggestion that I might have artistic talent worth developing was thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. For so long, I'd seen myself primarily in terms of my practical skills, my ability to organize, to budget, to solve problems. The idea that I might also be creative, that I might have aesthetic gifts worth nurturing, opened up possibilities I'd never considered. "I'm 62, I said, as if my age disqualified me from artistic ambition. "Georgia O'Keeffe didn't have her first major museum exhibition until she was 31, Elena replied. "Grandma Moses didn't start painting until she was in her 70s. You're right on schedule." The trip to Italy I'd booked was scheduled for May, just 2 weeks away. As the departure date approached, I found myself alternating between excitement and terror. I'd never traveled internationally alone. I'd never made major decisions without considering how they would affect my children's needs or schedules. The freedom was intoxicating and overwhelming. Rachel surprised me by offering to drive me to the airport. As we sat in traffic on the way there, she asked tentative questions about my itinerary, my hotel, my plans for each city I'd be visiting. "I'm proud of you," she said, as we pulled up to the departure terminal. "I know that probably sounds weird, coming from your daughter, but I'm proud of you for choosing yourself, for doing something just because you want to." The words meant more to me than any expensive gift she could have given. For the first time in our relationship, she was celebrating. My independence rather than my availability, my self-care rather than my self-sacrifice. "I'm scared," I admitted as we hugged goodbye at the curb. "I'm excited, but I'm also terrified." "Good," she said, grinning. That means you're doing something that matters. The flight to Rome was long but peaceful. I'd brought books to read, sketches to work on, a journal to fill with observations and reflections. As the plane crossed the Atlantic, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been when I first became a mother, full of dreams and ambitions that had gradually been subsumed by the demands of raising children and maintaining a household. That woman hadn't disappeared. She'd just been waiting, patient and persistent for permission to reemerge. Now, at 35,000 feet above the ocean, flying toward a country I'd dreamed of visiting for decades, I felt her stirring back to life. The Italy that unfolded before me over the next 2 weeks was everything I'd imagined, and more. Venice with its impossible beauty and labyrinthine waterways, Florence with its overwhelming artistic treasures, the Tuscan countryside with its rolling hills and medieval towns perched on impossibly steep cliffs. But more than the sights and experiences, it was the solitude that transformed me. For 2 weeks, I made every decision based solely on my own preferences. I ate when I was hungry, rested when I was tired, explored what interested me. I spent entire afternoons in museums, sketching sculptures and studying paintings. I took cooking classes where I learned to make fresh pasta and regional specialties. I sat in cafe squares, drinking wine and watching the world go by. Most importantly, I discovered that I genuinely enjoyed my own company. Without the constant noise of other people's needs and expectations, I could hear my own thoughts clearly for the first time in decades. I liked the rhythm of my own days, the pace of my own explorations, the freedom to change my mind without consulting anyone else. On my last night in Rome, I video called both of my children from my hotel room. Rachel answered immediately, her face bright with genuine interest. "Mom, you look amazing! Tell me everything. What was your favorite part? Did you try gelato? Did you go to the Vatican?" For 30 minutes, we talked about my adventures, my discoveries, my plans for the final day. She asked thoughtful questions and listened to my answers with the kind of attention I'd always given her stories, but had rarely received in return. David joined the call from his office during a break between patients, still in his white coat, but smiling more freely than I'd seen him do in months. "You look different," he said, studying my face through the screen. "Younger, somehow, happier." "I feel different," I admitted. "I feel like myself again, like the person I was before I forgot I was allowed to want things for myself." When we ended the call, I sat on my hotel balcony looking out over the eternal city, lights twinkling in the warm evening air. Tomorrow I would fly home to a new house, a new life, a new understanding of who I was and what I deserved. The woman who had been excluded from Christmas photos because she was too old was now creating her own beautiful moments, capturing her own memories, writing her own story of adventure and self-discovery. And for the first time in decades, she was exactly where she wanted to be. Returning from Italy felt like stepping into a parallel universe where everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar. My modest apartment, which had seemed perfectly adequate before my trip, now felt cramped and colorless after 2 weeks of sun-soaked piazzas and ancient stone buildings. But the discomfort wasn't distressing. It was motivating. It reminded me that I was in transition, moving from one version of my life to another, and temporary discomfort was part of the journey. The closing on my beach house was scheduled for the day after I returned, which meant I barely had time to do laundry before I was sitting in a lawyer's office, signing papers that would make me a homeowner for the first time in my life. At 62, I was finally buying a place that was entirely mine, chosen for my happiness rather than practical considerations like school districts or commute times. The house was even more perfect than I'd remembered. Perched on a small bluff overlooking the Atlantic, it had weathered cedar shingles that had turned silver gray from decades of salt air, wide windows that captured both sunrise and sunset, and a wraparound porch that invited long mornings with coffee and good books. The previous owners had maintained it beautifully, but I could already envision the changes I wanted to make. A garden bed filled with beach roses and lavender, reading nook in the alcove by the largest window, walls painted in the warm whites and soft blues I'd admired in Italian coastal towns. Moving day arrived with the kind of crystalline October weather that makes New England famous. Rachel and David both came to help, along with Jennifer and Marcus, and for the first time in recent memory, we worked together as a family without the undercurrent of financial obligation that had colored our interactions for so long. "Mom, this place is incredible," Jennifer said, standing on the deck and looking out at the ocean. "I can't believe you found something this beautiful in your budget." The comment was innocent enough, but it highlighted something important. My budget was now exactly that, mine. For the first time in decades, I didn't have to factor in monthly contributions to my children's lifestyles when making financial decisions. The freedom was both practical and psychological, allowing me to choose quality over economy, beauty over mere function. David spent the afternoon helping me set up my new art studio in the spare bedroom that faced north, providing the even light that Elena had taught me was ideal for painting. As we arranged easels and organized supplies, he asked questions about my work that revealed genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. "I never knew you were interested in art," he said, examining one of the watercolor landscapes I'd painted, in Italy. "This is really good, Mom. Like, genuinely good. Not just good for a beginner good." "I never knew either," I admitted. "I spent so many years focused on practical skills that I forgot to explore what I might enjoy. It's been a revelation to discover I have creative abilities I never developed." Rachel was in the kitchen, unpacking my dishes and arranging them in the cabinets with an eye for both function and aesthetics. "You know what I love about this house," she said as I joined her. "It feels like you, not like the apartment, which always felt temporary, like you were just passing through. This feels like home for someone who plans to stay and enjoy life." The observation was more perceptive than I'd expected. The apartment had indeed felt temporary, a place I'd endured rather than enjoyed. Even though I'd lived there for 15 years, I'd never invested in making it beautiful because every extra dollar went to my children's futures. This house, by contrast, was a statement of permanence, a declaration that I deserved to live somewhere that brought me daily joy. As evening approached and my family prepared to leave, I felt a bittersweetness that was new in our relationship. I was genuinely sorry to see them go, not because I needed their help or validation, but because I'd enjoyed their company. We'd spent the day talking about books and movies, sharing stories and laughter, connecting as people rather than as providers and receivers of support. "This feels different," Rachel said as she hugged me goodbye. Today felt like we were just family. Not family with an agenda or family with problems to solve. Just family. "That's what I've been hoping for," I said. "A relationship based on choice rather than need, on enjoyment rather than obligation." David lingered after the others had left, helping me arrange furniture and hanging pictures as the sun set over the water. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told me as we worked, "about seeing you as a person rather than a resource. I'm still figuring out how to do that, but I want you to know I'm trying." "I can see that," I said, "and I appreciate it more than you know." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd had before. He told me about his work, not the triumphant highlights he usually shared, but the challenging cases that kept him awake at night, the moments of uncertainty that reminded him he was still learning his profession. He asked about my art, my travel, plans, my thoughts on living alone by the ocean. "Are you lonely?" he asked as we stood on the deck, watching the last light fade from the sky. "No," I said, surprising myself with the certainty of my answer. "I'm alone, but I'm not lonely. There's a difference. Loneliness is wanting connection and not having it. This is choosing solitude and finding it peaceful." That night, in my new bedroom with its ocean view and salt-scented air, I slept more deeply than I had in years. I woke to the sound of waves and seagulls, made coffee on my new kitchen's generous counter space, and sat on the porch to watch the sunrise paint the water in shades of gold and pink. The routine that developed over the following weeks was simple, but profoundly satisfying. I woke early, not because I had to, but because the mornings were too beautiful to sleep through. I painted for several hours, losing myself in the challenge of capturing light on water, the texture of dune grass, the way morning mist softened the horizon line. I took long walks on the beach, collecting shells and sea glass, observing the subtle changes in weather and tide. Afternoons were for practical matters, grocery shopping in the charming downtown area, maintenance tasks around the house, correspondence with old friends who were delighted to hear from me and amazed by my transformation. Evenings were for reading, for simple dinners with wine, for phone calls with my children that felt more like conversations between friends than duties to be endured. The change in my relationship with Rachel was particularly dramatic. She began calling regularly, not when she needed something, but when she wanted to share something, a funny interaction at work, a book recommendation, a random thought that had occurred to her. Our conversations ranged from silly to profound, covering everything from celebrity gossip to philosophy to family history. "I've been thinking about Dad lately," she said during one of these calls. "I realized I don't really remember him as a person, just as my father. What was he like when you two were dating? What made you fall in love with him?" The question opened up memories I hadn't shared in years. I told her about Robert's terrible jokes and his unexpected sensitivity, his ambition balanced by his fundamental kindness, the way he'd supported my dreams even when we couldn't afford to pursue them immediately. "He would have loved seeing you like this," Rachel said when I finished. "Independent and adventurous and doing things just because they make you happy. He always said you were the strongest person he knew, but I think maybe you forgot that for a while." The observation hit me with surprising force. I had forgotten my own strength, or perhaps I'd redefined it so narrowly that strength meant only the ability to sacrifice and endure. Now I was rediscovering that real strength included the courage to choose yourself, to insist on your own worth, to build a life that reflected your values rather than other people's expectations. David's evolution was slower but equally meaningful. He began including me in his life in small but significant ways, inviting me to medical conferences where spouses were welcome, asking my opinion on professional decisions, sharing the day-to-day details of his work and marriage that he'd never bothered to mention before. The breakthrough came when he called one evening, his voice tight with stress. "Mom, I need advice. Not money, not help fixing anything, just perspective, from someone who's lived longer and seen more than I have." The request was so simple, so natural, but it represented a fundamental shift in how he saw me. For the first time, he was valuing my experience and wisdom rather than just my financial resources. The problem was work-related, a conflict with a senior colleague who was undermining his decisions and making his life miserable. As I listened to him describe the situation, I realized how rarely he'd asked for my emotional support over the years. He'd sought my financial backing for countless ventures, but he'd never turned to me for the kind of guidance that acknowledged my intelligence and life experience. "What would you do?" he asked when he'd finished explaining the situation. We talked for over an hour, exploring different approaches to the conflict, discussing the politics of medical practice, analyzing the personalities involved. I drew on my decades of business experience, my understanding of human nature, my hard-won knowledge of when to fight and when to step back. "This helps so much," he said as our conversation wound down. "I don't know why I never thought to ask you about stuff like this before." "Because you saw me as someone who solved financial problems, not someone who could help with professional challenges," I said gently. "But I've been navigating workplace politics and difficult relationships for 40 years. I might actually know a thing or two." The acknowledgement was both painful and hopeful. painful because it revealed how long he'd overlooked my expertise, hopeful because it suggested he was finally ready to see me as a complete person with valuable insights to offer. Winter arrived. Early that year, bringing dramatic storms that turned the ocean wild and magnificent. Instead of feeling isolated by the weather, I found myself energized by it. The cottage was warm and cozy, my art studio was productive and peaceful, and the dramatic seascapes outside my windows provided endless inspiration for my painting. I joined a local artists' collective, a group of painters and sculptors who met weekly to share work and offer constructive criticism. Many of them were women like me, people who had discovered or rediscovered their creativity later in life, after careers and child-rearing had consumed their earlier decades. "There's something about coming to art with life experience," said Margaret, a sculptor in her 70s who had started working with clay after her husband's death. "We're not trying to prove anything or build careers. We're just exploring what we can create when we're finally free to focus on our own vision." The observation resonated deeply. My art wasn't about external validation or commercial success. It was about the pure joy of creation, the meditative quality of focused attention, the satisfaction of improving with each piece I completed. I was painting for the same reason I'd moved to the coast and traveled to Italy, because it brought me pleasure and helped me understand who I was when I wasn't defined by my usefulness to others. Christmas approached with none of the anxiety that had marked the holiday for years. I wasn't hosting, wasn't cooking elaborate meals, wasn't managing other people's expectations or logistics. Instead, I was invited, genuinely invited, to spend Christmas Day with Rachel and Marcus in their Chicago apartment. "We want to cook for you," Rachel said when she called with the invitation. "We want to take care of you for once, instead of the other way around." The role reversal felt strange, but wonderful. On Christmas morning, I sat in their living room with a cup of coffee Rachel had made, watching Marcus prepare an elaborate brunch, while my daughter arranged flowers and set the table with obvious care. "I have something for you," Rachel said, handing me a carefully wrapped package. "It's not expensive, but I thought you might like it." Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal, its pages thick and cream-colored, perfect for sketching or writing. On the first page, she'd written, "For all the adventures still to come, love, Rachel." The gift was thoughtful and personal in a way her presence had never been before. She'd considered my interests, my new hobbies, my future plans. She'd given me something that acknowledged who I was becoming rather than who I'd always been. "This is perfect," I said, running my hands over the smooth leather cover. "I'll take it to Greece with me in the spring." "Greece?" Marcus asked, looking up from the stove. I'd been planning the trip for weeks, but hadn't mentioned it to anyone yet. "I'm thinking about island hopping for a month. Santorini, Mykonos, Crete, places where the light is supposed to be incredible for painting." The easy assumption that I would travel alone, make independent plans, pursue my own interests without consulting them first. This was the new normal I'd been working toward. My children's acceptance of my autonomy, their genuine interest in my adventures, felt like the greatest Christmas gift I could have received. As I drove home that evening, the winter landscape lit by a full moon reflecting off snow-covered fields, I thought about the woman who had stood in the hallway the previous Christmas, excluded from family photos because she was too old to fit their image of perfection. That woman had been invisible not because she lacked worth, but because she'd made herself small enough to fit into the margins of other people's lives. She'd confused selflessness with love, sacrifice with strength, being needed with being valued. The woman driving home to her ocean cottage was still the same person, but she'd expanded to fill the space she deserved. She'd claimed her right to dreams and adventures and beautiful things. She'd insisted on relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided utility. Most importantly, she'd learned that it's never too late to step out of the shadows and into the light of your own life. The best chapters, she'd discovered, might be the ones you write when you finally understand that you're the author of your own story. The Greece trip in April turned out to be more than just a vacation. It became a pilgrimage of sorts, a journey toward understanding what it meant to live fully in the present moment, rather than constantly preparing for other people's futures. I had booked a small apartment in Oia, Santorini, with a terrace that looked out over the famous blue-domed churches and the endless Aegean Sea. The first morning, I woke before dawn and climbed to the highest point of the village to watch the sunrise. As the sky transformed from deep purple to rose gold to brilliant orange, I set up my easel and attempted to capture the impossible beauty of light reflecting off whitewashed buildings and turquoise water. It was a humbling experience. The colors were so vivid, the contrasts so dramatic, that my paints seemed inadequate to the task. "You're up early," said a voice behind me. I turned to see a woman about my age, also carrying art supplies, her gray hair caught in a colorful scarf that fluttered in the morning breeze. "I couldn't bear to miss this," I replied, gesturing toward the spectacular view. Her name was Sophia, a retired art teacher from Athens who had been coming to Santorini every spring for 15 years. She painted with the confidence of someone who had made peace with imperfection, laying down bold strokes of color that somehow captured the essence of the scene better than my careful attempts at photographic accuracy. "You paint like someone who is afraid to make mistakes," she observed, watching me work. "But mistakes are where the magic happens. They force you to find solutions you never would have discovered otherwise." Over the following days, Sophia became both companion and mentor. She showed me hidden corners of the island where tourists never ventured, taught me to see the subtle color variations in what I had initially perceived as simply white buildings, and most importantly, encouraged me to paint with more courage and less self-consciousness. "Art is not about creating something perfect," she said as we sat in a taverna one evening, sharing grilled octopus and local wine. "It is about expressing what it feels like to be alive in this moment, in this place, with these eyes and this heart." The philosophy extended beyond painting. As we explored the island together, I found myself approaching everything with less planning and more spontaneity. Instead of researching the best restaurants, we wandered until we found places that appealed to us. Instead of following guidebook recommendations, we took random paths that led to unexpected discoveries: a tiny chapel built into a cliff face, a beach accessible only by scrambling down a goat path, an elderly man who invited us to taste wine from barrels in his family's cave cellar. "You are learning to trust yourself," Sophia observed as we sat on a secluded beach, our feet buried in volcanic sand. "This is harder than it sounds for women like us, who spent so many years trusting everyone else's needs more than our own instincts." The observation struck deep. For decades, I had lived according to other people's schedules, priorities, and definitions of what mattered. My children's school calendars had determined my vacation time. Their financial needs had shaped my career decisions. Their milestones and crises had provided the rhythm of my daily life. Now, for the first time since my 20s, I was living according to my own internal compass. I painted when the light inspired me, ate when I was hungry, rested when I was tired, explored when curiosity called. The freedom was intoxicating and occasionally overwhelming. After so many years of external structure, I sometimes felt unmoored by the vastness of choice. But gradually, I began to trust the quiet voice inside that had been speaking for years, waiting patiently for me to listen. It told me to book an extra week in Crete, where I wanted to paint the ancient olive groves. It urged me to sign up for a cooking class in a village where the only other students were Italian honeymooners. It whispered that I should buy the hand-woven scarf that cost more than I would normally spend on clothing, simply because it made me feel beautiful. The woman I was becoming in Greece felt both familiar and revolutionary. She was the person I might have been if I had never learned to make myself small, if I had never confused love with self-sacrifice, if I had understood earlier that taking care of myself was a prerequisite for genuinely caring for others. My children called regularly during the trip, but the conversations felt different than they had in the past. Instead of checking in out of obligation or guilt, they seemed genuinely curious about my experiences, eager to hear about my adventures and discoveries. "You sound so happy," Rachel said during one of our video calls. I was sitting on my terrace in Mykonos, the late afternoon light turning everything golden, my latest painting drying on the easel behind me. "I am happy," I replied, and realized with some surprise that it was completely true. "I'm discovering things about myself I never knew. Did you know I'm actually quite good at bargaining in markets? And I've learned enough Greek to have real conversations with people here." "I love seeing you like this," she said. "You look, I don't know how to describe it, like yourself, but more so, like you've been turned up a few notches." The metaphor was perfect. I hadn't become a different person. I had simply allowed myself to exist at full volume instead of constantly adjusting my intensity to accommodate other people's comfort levels. David's response to my transformation was more complex. During one of our calls, he admitted to feeling confused by the changes in our relationship. "I keep wanting to worry about you," he said. "Living alone, traveling by yourself, making all these big life changes. But every time I talk to you, you seem more capable and confident than I've ever seen you. It's like you've tapped into some source of strength I didn't know you had." "I always had it," I told him. "I just spent it all on other people for so long that I forgot it belonged to me too." The insight had crystallized during my time in Greece, watching Sophia move through the world with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted her right to take up space, to have opinions, to pursue her interests without apology. Strength wasn't just about endurance and sacrifice. It was also about self-advocacy and boundary setting, and the courage to disappoint people when necessary. When I returned home in May, the cottage felt like a sanctuary I had been away from for too long. The beach roses were blooming, filling the air with their sweet fragrance. The ocean had shifted from winter gray to spring blue-green. My art studio, bright with northern light and the paintings I had created before my trip, welcomed me back like an old friend. I spent the first week home organizing the work I had done in Greece, matting and framing the pieces I was most proud of. Looking at them arranged on my studio walls, I could see my progression not just as an artist, but as a person willing to take risks, to embrace imperfection, to trust her own vision. The local artist collective was eager to hear about my travels, and I found myself giving an impromptu presentation about painting in Mediterranean light, sharing techniques I had learned from Sophia and insights about working in unfamiliar environments. Afterward, several members approached me with questions and compliments that made me realize I was no longer just a beginner seeking instruction. I was becoming someone with knowledge worth sharing. "You should consider teaching," suggested Eleanor, a watercolorist who had been painting for decades. "The community college is always looking for people to lead workshops, and you have such an encouraging way of talking about art." The idea had never occurred to me, but it planted a seed that grew quickly. Teaching would allow me to share what I was learning while continuing to learn myself. It would provide structure and social connection without the pressure of commercial success. Most importantly, it would be work I chose based on passion rather than necessity. Within a month, I had developed a proposal for a summer workshop series called Art After 50, Discovering Creativity in Life's Second Act. The community. College accepted it immediately, and registration filled within days. The first class met on a warm June evening, 12 women and 3 men ranging in age from 52 to 78, all united by the desire to explore artistic expression later in life. As I stood in front of them, my heart racing with nervous excitement, I thought about how far I had traveled from the woman who had been excluded from Christmas photos just 18 months earlier. "Art is not about talent," I began, echoing Sophia's wisdom. "It's about courage. The courage to see the world through your own eyes and express what you find there. the courage to make mistakes and learn from them, the courage to create something that matters to you, regardless of whether it matters to anyone else. As the students began their first exercises, I moved among them, offering gentle encouragement and practical suggestions. I watched faces light up with discovery, saw hands that had spent decades caring for others begin to create something beautiful for its own sake. I realized I was witnessing the same transformation I had experienced, people reclaiming parts of themselves they had forgotten existed. Teaching reminded me that my journey toward self-reclamation wasn't just about me. It was part of a larger story about what becomes possible when we refuse to accept that our most vibrant years are behind us, when we insist on growth and adventure and new beginnings regardless of our age. The woman who had been told she was too old for family photographs was now inspiring others to see that being older might actually mean being more ready to take risks, more ready to prioritize authenticity over approval, more ready to live according to internal values, rather than external expectations. That summer, as I taught my workshops and continued my own artistic journey, I began to understand that the revelation I had experienced wasn't an ending, but a beginning. I had spent the first 60 years of my life learning how to take care of others. Now I was learning how to live, not just survive, not just endure, but truly live with passion and purpose and joy. The best part was knowing that this was just the start. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.